Camera Raw Smart Objects are the best way to create high-quality images in Photoshop. That is, unless you ignore a hidden but critical setting that can wreak absolute havoc on your images. Let's open up the same image a couple different ways to see the problem and how to fix it. For the first edit, let's just right-click, choose Edit In, and go to Open as Smart Object in Photoshop. In doing so, we're going to take all the slider values, all the radial and linear gradients that I've applied to it. Everything gets wrapped up into a smart object and sent over to Photoshop. And here you can see it's been opened up. In the Lumenzia Basics panel, I can see the raw button is lit green, meaning that this is a Camera Raw smart object. So everything is as we'd expect. And I'm just going to right click or double click and rename it to LR Edit In. So we remember how we created this version of the image. Let's go back, and this time let's right click, go Show in Finder. So we're going to open up directly from the disk. This is this file here, and all of the changes have been written to this raw, so they're identical. When I double click it, it's going to open up in Photoshop with all the same slider values, all the radial, linear gradients, everything I've done to this image is identical. So now I'm going to open it, but I'm going to hold on the Shift key so I get Open Object, which will open as a smart object when I click. And again, our smart object is showing green with the Basics Raw button, so we know that this is a Camera Raw smart object. Let's double click and we'll just call it via ACR so we know how we got here. Now, in comparing these two, they look the same. Let's put them together and make some more direct comparisons. I'm going to hit Command C to copy, switch over, hit Command V to paste, and so that way we'll have both versions in the same document. So again, they look the same, but on closer inspection, they are absolutely not the same. Let's go and add a brightness contrast adjustment layer, which we might want to use to bring some more color back to the sun and darken it down. So let's just bring it down maybe 50 or so. And right now what we're getting is that adjustment on the ACR version here, because that's what's visible. The version beneath is not visible. It's hidden by this layer. But we can hide this layer and compare the same adjustment on the two versions. So here's the adjustment on ACR, and here's the version on the Lightroom export. So what is going on? Why do we have such a dramatic difference in the sun? The version from Lightroom looks much, much better here than the ACR version does here, where there's more color channel clipping. It just looks more dead around the sun. That's a pretty substantial difference in these two versions. But that's not the whole story. There's actually more going on than that. If we go, let's just hide this and go to Lumenzia. Let's go to the check dust feature, which gives us a way of making high contrast comparisons. Zoom way in on this thing. Go to at least 100% to get a fair comparison, and just look at the two versions and notice that aside from what we already knew about the area around the sun, in the sun and other high bright areas here, there's actually a considerable amount of noise that's being introduced into this image. So how is that? We have the exact same raw image. We have the exact same slider values. We could go and compare them. All of them would be identical, I promise you. And both of these are in ProPhoto RGB, because that's the document space, and 16 bits per channel. You can always check this in the info panel by going up to the panel options and then turning on the profile stuff. So they're in the same working space and bit depth, and yet they look different with the same slider values. Well, how is that? The reason is that there's a little bit more to the story. If we double click our smart object, take a look at the sliders and everything are the same, but take a look at the bottom. In Adobe Camera Raw, you have this little clickable link. And what this is telling you is the color space and bit depth that's used to process the raw. So they're going to be exported here to an image which is in ProPhoto 16-bit. But before they get there, they're going to be squeezed down into this smaller bit depth and smaller gamut, and then scaled up essentially to this document. So it's just like if we took this document, converted to 8 bits, and then went back to 16, we would be losing quality. That's what's happening here, is this pipeline is forcing us through this color space and bit depth before it renders to the one in our document. And you might ask why, but remember that we've got a histogram. And as I move around the image, notice the RGB values. We've also got things like these clipping warnings. So Adobe Camera Raw needs some kind of color space and bit depth to generate all of this data. And that's what this is driving right here. So what we want to do is have this be as good or better than the document's requirements, so that we're not limiting ourselves before we even get to the document. Let's go click on this, and you see now we bring up some options where we can change the settings. And let's just go change things kind of one at a time here. I'm going to go change the color space to ProPhoto RGB because the master document is ProPhoto. Let's say okay to that, and we'll just say okay here. So it's going to be re-rendered with these settings in this master document. And we see some changes, but we still see some noise, which is not surprising because we didn't fix the bit depth. But let's look at that brightness contrast adjustment and just zooming back here a bit. Now, if we compare these two layers, they look identical through the same adjustment. So the problem with the color was coming from the smaller Adobe RGB space, wasn't giving us the flexibility that we were getting from Pro Photo. So that's one of the arguments why you might want to use a larger color space. And rendering internally as Pro Photo and then externally in the document as Pro Photo lets us preserve that extra data. So let's take a look now at fixing the other issue with the bit depth. So we'll double click in here, click on this again, and we're going to change this over to 16 bits per channel. Say okay, and now we've fixed the remaining issue. And now let's look at that check dust comparison and just zoom right back in to at least 100%. And notice now that they are identical. So even though we originally clipped this document to a smaller gamut and smaller bit depth, because it's a RAW, we were able to recover it by double clicking into it and then changing those settings. So now the question is, how do we make sure that those settings are correct when we import so we don't run into problems like we had with this version of the image? Well, the first clue here is take a look at the other document we opened. It's noting that it's 8 bits here. And if we look at the info panel, make sure you go to the settings, go to panel options, and just choose this document profile. Now you can see this here, which is showing us that we are in Adobe RGB and 8 bits per channel. So what happens is if it uses those settings on import, then the document will get set to the same values. Now there's no reason I can't change this now, but if we see this when we import the image, we know that that's what was applied to the RAW. That's kind of the first clue. And the question is, why did this import pathway use different values than we got with this import pathway? And the reason is that there's defaults in Photoshop and Lightroom, and depending on which one you use, those are the presets that get applied. So let's go back to Lightroom and take a look at the options here. We'll go up to our preferences, and you want to switch over to the external editing tab and notice that I've got Pro Photo and 16-bit for all my editor options. And that's why the version exported using Edit in Open as Smart Object came up with the Pro Photo and 16-bit that looks so great. If we switch over to Photoshop, the settings are a little bit different here. We go to Preferences, go down to File Handling, and then we can go to Camera Raw Preferences. And notice this dialog looks just like the one I had a moment ago inside ACR. It's actually the same thing, and it matches what we had there because I changed it through Adobe Camera Raw. But by default, when you install Photoshop, it's actually going to say Adobe RGB and 8 bits here. So I would go into these settings, definitely make sure you get it set to 16 bits per channel so you're getting high quality. That's going to be the big loss. And if you really want to keep full color, I would go choose something like Pro Photo RGB. Now, unlike Lightroom, your color space options here are whatever you have installed on your machine. And you might want to choose something like Beta RGB. You might want to choose something like Rec 2020. I would probably avoid one of these other color spaces, even though they're great to work with and can be great for printing. The caveat here is, let's say I go choose Beta RGB as my space, and that's fine. But if I go open this image, if I save it and open on another computer, and that computer does not have Beta RGB or whatever space I choose installed, then when I open the image, everything will be fine. But if I double click to edit that RAW Smart Object, the moment I start editing in Adobe Camera Raw, if it can't find this color space installed on the computer, then it's going to fall back to whatever preferences you have in this dialog. So you could switch from Beta RGB to probably you'd end up with Adobe RGB as a default on some other computer if that wasn't installed. So just to watch out that if you're working with multiple computers, that you either want to make sure you install the same space everywhere, or just stick with one of the safe defaults since you know they'll be installed on any computer, and Pro Photo RGB is an excellent choice to keep all the best color in your images. Now watch this next video to learn all about the power of Camera Raw Smart Objects in Photoshop.